Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Lois here and welcome to the next in my new series of quick watercolour tips. This is watercolour tip number 4. If you'd like to see more tips, then please look at the playlist here on our channel. Tip number 4 is going to be looking at an easier and fairly reliable way of painting dry brush. Dry brush is really difficult. It looks beautiful. It's where the brush sort of skips over the texture of the paper and leaves that lovely sparkle of either unpainted paper or the colour of watercolour underneath showing through a darker glaze of dry brush. And it's quite a difficult thing to achieve, particularly when you first start out. It can be really effective here. It adds to this landscape scene that I did a few years ago and really does evoke sort of ploughed fields and this kind of the rough, scrubby, frosty ground of winter. In urban landscapes, it can be particularly useful for adding the texture of roads and buildings and also light catching on glass and cars and various parts of the scene. And it's especially useful if you like to paint abstracts because it adds that extra texture to an abstract painting in watercolour. It can really help with layering up and with bringing light and shadow into your painting. But as I say, it's quite a tricky technique to master. But as it's one of the most beautiful effects in watercolour, in my opinion, I think it's well worth taking the time to try and master it. But if you do find it really difficult, and if you ever find that you mess up on your dry brush on a painting, then I also have a tip for how to rescue a failed dry brush stroke. So have a look in the watercolour tips playlist for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix up a bit of paint on my palette. This is just cerulean blue. I'm using my large flat brush. It's a Watercolor brush, Princeton Aqua Elite. And I'm going to simply paint some ordinary brush strokes. You can see the important thing here is that the angle that I'm holding my brush at is about 90 degrees to the page, maybe slightly less, and I'm pressing the brush into the paper as I pull my brush stroke across so that it's going, the paint is being pushed into the surface of the paper, even though the paper is quite textured. And you can do this with any brush. It takes a bit of practice because different brush heads will behave in slightly different ways. But the way to get a sort of dry brush is to hold your brush at a slightly different angle when you're trying to make a dry brush stroke. So remember, when I made that last brush stroke, the brush was about 90 degrees, maybe slightly less, to the page. For a dry brush stroke, you want a really shallow angle, almost as shallow as you can get it. You're just going to touch the whole of the belly of the brush, no matter what shape it is. You're going to touch that to the paper and keep a really shallow angle. With a large flat brush like this, then you're going to want a really shallow angle. And you can see as I make the brush stroke, my brush is probably at about sort of 30, 40 degrees, maybe slightly less. And as my belly of my brush sort of strokes across the texture of the paper lightly, you can see the paint is catching on the raised parts of the texture, but it's not being pressed down into the paper dips of the texture, if you see what I mean. If we look closely, I hope you can see. So you also want to make sure that you don't use a really wet mixture of paint. If your paint mix is really wet, then it will just sort of slop into the dips and pits anyway. So remember, we've got that angle. See this steeper angle of sort of between about 90 and 80 degrees? We're pushing the paint into the texture of the paper. Dry brush, the angle is shallower and we just brush across the texture. You can of course practice this with different brushes that you use. on the backs of old paintings or scraps of paper. Bear in mind, this is best done on rough or cold pressed paper with texture. It's a slightly different ball game on hot press, and I'm not going to cover that here. So the first thing to remember is the angle of your brush to your paper, and also to make sure that you haven't got too wet a mix of paint. My suggestion is that you always have a scrap of the same paper that you're using for your painting next to you, and if you want to make a dry brush stroke, test out your paint mix and your brush on the paper to make sure you've got the angle right, and to make sure that the brush head is in the right kind of position and shape, just to brush over the texture of the paper. If you practice this with all your brushes that you use, then you'll build up confidence and be able to use this effect with all your brushes. It's worth bearing in mind that it's easier to make this dry brush stroke with a slightly stiffer style of brush. This is a squirrel style synthetic brush, which is very soft, but you can still, with care, skim it across the surface of the paper with using that shallow angle, and still get those beautiful effects. So to sum up, dry brush stroke is best made on paper with texture, so cold pressed paper or rough textured paper. Make sure that your paint mix isn't too wet, and if your paint mix is too wet when you test it on a piece of scrap paper, then touch your paintbrush to a paper towel or a piece of tissue, and that will soak off the excess moisture. Then test it again, and then when you try to make the brush stroke, keep your angle of the brush fairly shallow against the paper. Well, good luck with that. I hope that you enjoy using this technique, and let me know what you think. And if you have any other tips about how to produce this beautiful effect of dry brush, then we'd love to read your ideas in the comments below. So thank you for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thanks so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. And I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.